Hi Booktube, it's Amy. I thought I'd pop in with another video here. Today I have End Papers by A. Edward Newton. This volume published in 1933 with a copyright date of 1931 on some of the essays. And the other day we read the very first essay in this collection titled Lawyers Were Children Once. And today I thought we'd read the second essay, which is titled On Forming a Library. So these are renowned book collector A. Edward Newton's thoughts on forming a personal library. Every collector has, I suppose, received requests to show his collection to some person or persons who think they are interested, but who in fact merely want to say, "Oh yes, I know Mr. Blank and his collection very well." Now, if one is lucky enough to have collected paintings or prints or indeed anything that will display itself, it is easy enough to say, "Come when you like," and on the arrival of one's guests, turn them loose. But with books, which must be shown and explained, it is a very different matter. This is what I mean. There is a little volume of poems by Currier Ellis and Acton Bell, actually the three Bronte sisters. A copy with the Allerton Jones imprint may be worth £500 or £600, while the same book with a Smith Elder imprint is no great bargain at 10. A collector of English poetry hardly needs to be told the sad history of this slender volume, how one day Charlotte Bronte found a blank book filled with verses in the handwriting of Emily, and how after much discussion and some correspondence, the three sisters, for Anne wrote also, decided upon the publication of a small volume which should contain verses by all of them. But no publisher cared for the venture, finally, until Messrs. Allowit and Jones of London agreed to publish upon the payment by them of £30-odd. The girls agreed, and after some delay the volume appeared. A year later the publishers reported the sale of just 2 copies. The disappointment of the sisters may be imagined, but they took the blow philosophically, and each giving away a copy or 2, decided to send the remaining sheets to the trunk makers. But finally, having received an offer from Smith, Elder and Company, they transferred the sheets to them, and in due course to the public. Hence it is that a copy of the book with the Allerton Jones imprint is rare. There is, too, some farther question as to binding. Some copies have a Lear stamped in blind upon the side, others a geometrical design which has priority, and there's a question mark there. And so the question is the one stamped with a Lear or the one stamped with the geographical design the true first edition, first printing, first impression? And I guess that question mark means that no one quite knows which of those came first. My friend Morris L. Parrish says that there are at least 4 different bindings, and that the geometrical is the earliest. That is one matter settled. Some such explanation as this has to be made about pretty much every book one shows to one's visitor, if he is to carry away with him any proper idea of what a collection of rare books really is. And so there we have our answer. We have one collector who says that the geometrical design is the earliest and therefore would have priority in the mind of a book collector and perhaps might be worth a little bit more. Just what that proof is, Newton isn't sharing with us, and perhaps Morris Parrish didn't share that proof with him, but there is an answer for us. Some such explanation as this has to be made about pretty much every book one shows to one's visitor, if he is to carry away with him any proper idea of what a collection of rare books really is. One can make such an explanation once, or even 10 times, with a certain amount of enthusiasm. After that it becomes a task. I once had this experience. I found a man rubbing his dirty hands over a fine copy of Blake's Songs of Innocence, and assuring another that it must be lithographed, because it was coloured. My first thought was to kill this man, but realizing that he might be dear to someone, I let him live. Relating this experience to a friend in London, he told me how he dealt with such situations. My friend has a famous collection of modern poetry: Wordsworth, Shelley, Byron, Keats, Tennyson, Browning, and the rest, all in excellent original bindings. When strangers descend upon him, he does not show his rare books, but something which pleases his visitors quite as well, taking a small key from his pocket and pointing to a case over in a corner, he says something like this: "You know poetry is my strong point. Here is the key to that bookcase yonder. Be very careful, but enjoy my books to your heart's content." Then, when he sees a book tumble to the floor, or the rector set a teacup on a book instead of on a saucer, he never turns a hair, for all the books in that case have been picked up at odd times and places for about 6 pence each, invariably lacking the points which would make them valuable. They might indeed be called lightning rods, designed to protect first editions from destruction. By this little chicken all parties are pleased. Mr. Blank has shown his books, and Mr. Splash and Miss Dash have seen them. But I have had other experiences. Some time ago, Professor Spiller of Swarthmore College brought to my house a company of young men and maidens who were taking English under his direction, and I was struck with their keenness and intelligence. One of them, a mere slip of a girl, stood up to me and put me through an oral examination of Boswell's Life of Johnson, from which it was difficult for me to escape with credit. So when, quite recently, that same Spiller asked if he might bring a small group to see my books, I wrote him that I would take on 10 or a dozen students on any afternoon that would be convenient to all parties. In due course my guests arrived. Some entered my library shyly, some inquiringly, some keen upon seeing a first edition of some particular book which they had been studying under Professor Spiller's guidance. And here let me digress long enough to say that if I were a teacher of English literature, I should try to instill into pupils the idea that literature is a reflex of life, and endeavor to make it as interesting as life itself. It is a terrible thing to let a student get the idea into his head that some great world-rocking book is required reading. And if I were asked how this is to be done, I should say, treat every book as though it were a great man. In the words of Walt Whitman, "Camarado, this is no book. Who touches this touches a man." But however much of a man a book may be, today it was once almost certainly a child. Its birth may have occasioned its parent an amount of anguish which the mother who bore you never knew. Great books have to struggle for existence. For every book that survives, 1,000, 10,000 fall. It is worthwhile, then, to examine the survivor carefully and discover why it has withstood the changes and chances of this wicked world. But to return to my visitors. There was, I fancy, a certain amount of shyness at first, but it soon passed off. Then someone asked a question, and before it was fully answered, another was asked, and almost before we knew it, the ice was broken, and we all began to have a good time. I never met a more intelligent lot of boys and girls. One lad instantly challenged my attention by asking if I had a first Lyrical Ballads. To ask such a question is to start something, for this is perhaps the most significant, interesting, and tricky volume of poetry in our literary history, and presently I was engaged in telling my interrogator the story of the first issue of this book, which is indeed not unlike that of the Bronte sisters, except that in due course it was seen that Lyrical Ballads marked a turning point in English poetry. And I went on to say that when the first issue was brought out by Briggs and Cottle at Bristol in 1798, its sale was but little larger than the first issue of the Bronte poems, and that the book, for the copyright of which Cottle had paid Wordsworth 30 guineas, was also in peril of the trunk maker, when he decided to ship the book in quires up to London, where it appeared under the patronage of J. and A. Arch. And very gradually, the book made its way. All this took place in 1798. The first poem in the little volume was the rhyme of the Ancient Mariner, no mention being made of the fact that it was by Coleridge. 2 years later, another Lyrical Ballads in 2 volumes, with Wordsworth's name on the title page, appeared with a long and elaborate preface in which the author developed his idea of what poetry is and should be. A quick sale is usually synonymous with an early death. A slow halting sale, like a flickering flame never quite going out but always looking as though it would, may presage a conflagration. But the Lyrical Ballads in 2 volumes we now know contains some of the finest poetry ever written. At length comes the bibliophile, the collector, that says to himself or out loud, I must have a Lyrical Ballads with the Bristol imprint. How many are there? I don't know. Mr. T.J. Wise of London, whose word is law, tells me he knows of 6. I once, many years ago, had a copy offered me for $750. But I couldn't see it. The $750, that is. Mrs. Cynthia Morgan St. John did, however, and her entire Wordsworth collection, probably the finest in the country, was later given to Cornell University by Victor Emmanuel. Swinburne calls it the black tulip of English literature. What is a copy worth today? Who shall say? $5,000 or $10,000 perhaps. They are unobtainable. A copy with the London imprint is worth $500 at present, and is pointed to 10 times the figure. My copy, bound but uncut, with the errata and the 2 pages of advertisements, was once dear at £5. All this may be dull going to the reader, but to a student who is reading seriously, it is a great delight to hold in his hands the cluster of little volumes which once made such a stir in the world before the theories which they expounded had gained acceptance. While I was endeavoring to make this, or something like this, clear, I could see a girl who was eagerly awaiting a pause to break in with a question. Had I a copy of Blake's Poetical Sketches, and was it not published earlier, and did he not anticipate Wordsworth in his breaking with the school of Pope? Yes to all your questions, was the reply. Here is the Poetical Sketches, 1783. But Blake was a shooting star whose light went out. Wordsworth founded a school. His influence continues right down to the present. Matthew Arnold, who is only now taking his proper place as a poet, was especially influenced by him. Yes, I think Arnold's sonnet to Shakespeare was very fine. I don't know that it shows the influence of Wordsworth especially, but it is magnificent. Others abide our question, thou art free. We ask and ask, thou smilest and art still, outtopping knowledge. It was written when Arnold was a very young man. The original manuscript I read a few weeks ago in the British Museum. Yes, it is almost an impertinence to praise Shakespeare. Yes, I have visited Netherstowey, and a more sordid, miserable town I have seldom seen. Coleridge does not interest me much. I was early set against him by an essay in Augustine Birrell's Obterdicta. Let me read you a bit out of the volume I bought in 1885 and have read many times since. Lamb, speaking of his sister Mary, who, as everyone knows throughout Elia, is called his cousin Bridget, says, It has been the lot of my cousin, oftener perhaps than I could have wished, to have had for associates and mine free thinkers, leaders, and disciples of novels, philosophies, and systems. But she neither wrangles with nor accepts their opinions. Nor did her brother. He lived his life cracking his little jokes and reading his great folios, neither wrangling with nor accepting the opinions of the friends he loved to see around him. To a contemporary stranger, it might well have appeared as if his life were a frivolous and useless one as compared with those of these philosophers and thinkers. They discussed their great schemes and affected to probe deep mysteries and were constantly asking, What is truth? He sipped his glass, shuffled his cards, and was content with the humbler inquiry, What are trumps? But to us, looking back upon that little group, and knowing what we now do about each member of it, no such mistake is possible. To us it is plain beyond all question that, judged by whatever standard of excellence it is possible for any reasonable human being to take, Lamb stands head and shoulders a better man than any of them. No need to stop to compare him with Godwin or Hazlitt or Lloyd. Let us boldly put him in the scales with those whose fame it is, whose fame is in all the churches, with Samuel Taylor Coleridge, logician, metaphysician, and bard. There is something more, but it ends with, There are some men whom to abuse is pleasant. Coleridge is not one of them. How gladly we would love the author of Christabel, if we could. But the thing is flatly impossible. His was an unlovely character. In early manhood, Coleridge planned a pantisocracy where all the virtues were to thrive. Lamb did something far more difficult. He played cribbage every night with his imbecile father, whose constant stream of querulous talk and fault-finding might well have goaded a far stronger man into practicing and justifying neglect. Coleridge married. Lamb, at the bidding of the duty, remained single, wedding himself to the sad fortune of his father and sister. Shall we pity him? No, he had his reward, the surpassing reward that is only within the power of literature to bestow. It was Lamb and not Coleridge who wrote Dream Children, a Reverie. This is a long quotation, but it served to introduce one of my most valued possessions, the original manuscript of Dream Children. It was written on India House paper, when Charles Lamb should have been busying himself with the price of ivory and indigo and such matters. Yes, I think the last paragraph of Dream Children ties with Sterne's Recording Angel paragraph in Tristram Shandy as the finest bit of prose in the language, and I feel sure that Professor Winchester, that admirable critic, would have agreed with me. Tristram Shandy? Yes, and a great book it is. First edition, in 9 volumes, in red Levant over there. Then I went on to say that I little thought, almost 50 years ago, that one day I should call Augustine Birrell a personal friend. Yes, I know him very well. I gave him a luncheon at the Garrick Club the last time I was in London. He is a crusty old bookman, but I hope someday to be a crusty old bookman myself. I had a letter from him only a few days ago, in which, speaking of Dickens, he said, "My love for him burns as brightly as ever." Bless his heart, Birrell is now in his 84th year, and is a good deal of a prisoner in his home in Chelsea. He is a fellow trustee of the Johnson House in Gough Square, and used to be one of the best after-dinner speakers in London, full of grit, wisdom, and wit, with the grit first. My Johnsons are over there under the portrait, quite a row of them. No, I do not pretend to understand Blake's prophetic books, and I mistrust the man who says he does. Moby Dick? Now you are talking. I have the English edition in 3 volumes, which was published in London in 1851, and the New York edition published the same year in 1. It is said that the 3-volume edition is shorter than the 1-volume edition. It would be interesting to compare the differences between the 2 texts and discover what, if anything, is omitted. But Moby Dick, any edition, English or American, is not 1 book, but 2. There is the book which you may read at a glance, and a book written between the lines, as it were, a book as psychical and as mystical as if it had been written by Swedenborg, whose disciple, in a sense, its author surely was. Melville was a genius, and like most great geniuses, was neglected in his lifetime. He was only a little more than 30 years of age when he wrote the book, by which he will always be remembered. With its publication, he practically ceased to exist, for while he lived in New York until 1891, he did nothing important. His candle went out, but not until he had illuminated with it the paths of countless other men. Everyone who has written of the sea since Herman Melville is indebted to him. My Pickwick papers, I have 2, one too good to show, and one just good enough. Paradise Lost? Yes, in the safe in the other room. A Comus too. No, I have no Bunyan's Pilgrim Progress. It's a very rare book. Yes, Dr. Rosenbach has one, and my friend Sir Leicester Harmsworth has 2. Yes, I have a first folio of Shakespeare. My ambition has been to get a copy of the first issue of every great, superlatively great book in English literature. No, I have not achieved it. Who does? And my progress is very slow. Understand rightly the terms which we are using. Gray's Elegy is a great poem, but not excessively rare. Congreve's Incognita is excessively rare, but not great. My favorite novelist? Dickens, in spots. But for steady reading, Trollope. My favorite novel? Well, that depends on the weather. Yes, I love Jane Austen. And so it went on for several hours, one question after another, light and heavy, until I happened to notice that Spiller was regarding my mental acrobatics with some amusement, whereupon I said to him, "You can afford to smile. You are highly paid, hear, for answering such questions. I am doing it for fun. How on earth did you arouse in these young people such an interest in books?" And then he let me into the secret. Now comes the pit of this paper. It appears that several years ago, a gentleman now dead conceived the idea of giving Swarthmore College a small sum of money, $50 I think it was, each year to be awarded as a prize to the student, man or woman, who, during his or her term at college, formed the best collection of books. It was not originally thought to be a matter of much importance, and the rules laid down for the selection of the winner were not too rigid. Then someone in authority appointed a committee to make the award. Unfortunately, at the death of the originator of the scheme, it was found that no provision had been made for carrying on the idea, and it was feared that the present year would be the last in which the prize would be awarded. Immediately it struck me here was a way in which I might do much good with little money, as Benjamin Franklin often did. He once wrote a friend, "I am not rich enough to afford much in good works, and so am obliged to be cunning and to make the most of a little." The more I thought of this Swarthmore idea, as I called it, the more it appealed to me. How Franklin would have rejoiced at the idea of perpetually making a book lover, or several book lovers, for so small a sum as $50. So I then and there told Spiller that I was prepared to carry on the plan, taking care that the scheme would not lapse at my death. President Adelouette was made acquainted with my offer, accepted it, and the deed was done. The idea of making the award permanent seemed to make it advisable to formulate a set of rules. With these I wished to have nothing to do, for I am personally an unruly fellow. It seemed, however, necessary to consider some standards to which those entering the competition might be referred, and the following ideas were suggested by those having the matter in charge. That an award of $50 should be made annually to the student who, during an agreed-upon term, had A. Formed the best, not the largest collection of books in one or more departments in which the student was specializing, be it literature, chemistry, engineering, or what not. B. Given evidence by the selection and care of his books, of his appreciation at the joy of ownership. It was recognized that few, if any, students can, while at college, afford the luxury of first editions, but well-edited editions, printed by responsible publishers, are always to be preferred to showy books made to sell rather than to be read. And C. Could pass reasonably well an oral examination upon his library, and who knew why the edition he had selected was to be preferred to some other. The idea can be made of great and lasting benefit and delight to those who in the formative years learn the joy of having a collection of books of one's own. And there is no college so poor as not to have a man or group of men who will bind themselves to give every year $50 or $100 for the purpose indicated. God forbid that I should say a word against a public library, but nothing will take the place of a rack or a shelf full of books by one's own chair, close to a well-adjusted light, whether it be a lamp or a window. Everyone's shelves will contain different books, and books which give joy to youth may not delight age, but the pleasure of reading continues. And we'll just pause here to look at an image which is titled "Jimmy Hatlow Visualizes the Author of This Book Collecting Game." And there is a man with a pipe and a long beard in a horse-drawn carriage, absolutely packed with a stack of books. The habit, firmly established, enables one to endure, if need be, misfortune and even disgrace. I see today greater anxiety written on the faces of my millionaire friends than on the faces of the poor men who resort day after day to our public libraries, there to solace themselves with a book. In an established love of reading, there is a policy of insurance, guaranteeing certain happiness till death. The afternoon was drawing to a close. I was tired, but my visitors were inexhaustible. I asked someone, have I forgotten who, to send me an essay he had written on the subject of the award, which subsequently I read with pleasure, and with increased belief in the plan. I deeply regret that it is not original with me. It is something to be able to pass it on. I agreed to visit Swarthmore and make the next award. I did so and had no difficulty out of 16 entries in selecting the best. It was the library of William H. Cleveland, the young fellow who had questioned me upon Wordsworth's Lyrical Ballads. If he had any first or scarce editions, I did not see them. There were no sets, but a better selected lot of books, poetry, essays, fiction, and biography, 100 or so, I never saw. In many of the books, a special index of ideas rather than of names had been made on the blank leaves at the end, supplemented with a few extra sheets. I myself make such notes when reading, but my lists are always a mess and are largely unintelligible, whereas Cleveland's indexes were alphabetically arranged and neatness itself. In these days, it is not necessary for a man to spend much money upon the purchase of a representative collection of books. Well, it is a pleasant thing to have many and fine books. It is by no means necessary, for, as Voltaire said, it is with books as with men, a very small number play a very great part. The great publishing houses vie with one another in bringing out libraries of books, which have the merit of being clearly printed on good paper, well bound, and of a size which may be easily held in the hand and carried in one's pocket. What could be better and cheaper than the volumes in the Everyman's Library of Messrs. Dent, or the World Classics issued by the Oxford University Press, to mention only two of the many libraries which have very largely taken the place of the old bond books, which were popular when I was a lad. Carlyle suggests somewhere that the main use of college training is to teach one to read, the true university being a collection of books. 100 great books, or half that many, may well supply one with the intellectual stimulation and recreation of a lifetime. We have been told that no man is a hypocrite in his pleasures. Quite so, and a man may so train himself that his pleasure may be had from reading the best books. I know whereof I speak. It would be a pleasant thing to compile a list of 100 great books which nobody reads today. This is not to suggest that they are useless. It means simply that they have done their work, and that they have been chewed and digested, in Bacon's phrase, and have unconsciously become a part of us, and we, without our knowing it, have become a part of them. Lewis Hind, a few years ago, published a book in London in which he showed that by the expenditure of only £12, one could buy 100 of the world's best books. His list would not be my list, nor would my list be his, but almost any list is a good list provided it is selected honestly. Shortly after my experience with my young college friends, I sat next to an important New York publisher at dinner, and I talked to him about the Swarthmore scheme, as I called it. He was strong for it, wanted me to write a little book about it, which he said he would publish, but I wanted a wider spreading of the idea. It is for that reason that this paper first appeared in the Atlantic Monthly. That a publisher would be taken with the idea is not remarkable. The number of book buyers would be increased by the general acceptance of the scheme. Publishers have to think of sales, but I am not a publisher. I am thinking only of the pleasure with which a man in after years will point to the collection of books made when a student at college. Those books, he might say, established in me the love of reading, and the love of reading has been the joy and solace of my life. And so this paper is, in a way, an advertisement of an idea. And any skillful advertising man will tell you that, provided the idea is good, it is just as easy to advertise an idea as it is to advertise a hat or a pair of shoes, and the thoughtful reader is asked to answer to himself whether the idea of which I have told is good or no. I repeat that it is not mine. I am, to use a modern phrase, merely selling it. I hope to have advertised a good idea neatly. In any event, Swarthmore College is committed to it, and that, in the mind of the judicious, is a guarantee of its excellence. And that brings us to the end of the essay on forming a library. And as you can see, I have formed my library, and I do believe it is a lifelong solace.